Chantal Mouffe e non c'è bisogno di presentazione, la conoscete tutti, conoscete i suoi lavori, sapete che dirige il Center for the Study of Democracy a Westminster University in Gran Bretagna e insomma è inutile ripetere i temi dei suoi lavori e do immediatamente la parola a Chantal.
I'm going to use this one.
Yes.
Let me go with... on the top. Yes, it's okay. Well, okay. Well, thank you very much, Simona, and thank you to Davide for the invitation. I must specify that I'm not going to speak about the relation between psychoanalysis and politics. I'm going to speak of the relation between, political theory and politics, but the kind of political theory that I develop and that I'm going to use here is a political theory which is very much informed by psychoanalysis. So I mean, I'm not going to refer exactly to psychoanalysis, but many of the arguments that I'm going to make are possible because of the political theory which I've developed, and basically as a critique of traditional rationalistic political theory, precisely because I think that most political theory is not yet really come to terms with the Freudian revolution and with psychoanalysis. So I've been trying to a certain extent to develop a political theory that will, really use many important insights from psychoanalysis. So this is, how I want to locate my presentation. The title is An Agonistic Approach to the Recent Protest Movement. Let me just say very clearly at the beginning to specify what kind of protest movement I'm going to refer to. I'm going to really concentrate on protest movement taking place in liberal democratic societies, so in Europe and in the US more specifically. Because I think that there is really a tendency to homogenize all those protest movements. And you sometimes see that people put together the Tunisia, Egypt, Libya, and even Syria, and then the riots in Britain and the struggles in Israel and everything. And this is really very unhelpful, because I think that those movements are all very different, and it's important to not uniformize them in that way. But of course I'm not going to enter into a careful analysis of those diverse popular mobilization, because I think their interests, their contexts are much too different. And in fact my aim is here to examine the response of radical political theorists to those movements and the different ways in which they've been interpreted. Many claims have been made on behalf of what is construed as a new type of activism, moved by an universal desire for communism, real democracy, or the common. And the reaction that those mobilizations have provoked are, I think, worth scrutinizing, since they touch directly on several questions that I have addressed in my work. I think that will also give me the opportunity to test the pertinence of my agonistic approach for grasping the specificity of the current situation. So I'm going to basically contrast my agonistic approach with another important approach in radical theory, of which I'm going to speak in a moment. Leaving aside the uprising in the Middle East, that I think require really a different analysis, I'm going to concentrate on how the various mobilization in liberal democratic societies have been interpreted. We find a broad agreement on at least one aspect. The recent protests are not mere reaction to the current austerity measure. They reveal a more profound political malaise vis-à-vis democratic institutions, whose crisis they bring to the fore. And it is with respect to the cause of such a crisis and the remedies that are needed that opinion diverge. In examining those divergences, we will see that they proceed from the different approach to radical politics either in terms of what I propose to call withdrawal from or engagement with. This is a distinction that I have made in my recent work. Withdrawal from, I refer that to the strategy of exodus, the strategy which is, epitomized by Art, Negri, and the post-operaïsts, and all the people who are influenced by them, and the strategy of engagement with, which is the strategy that we, Ernesto, myself, and the people who are, following the hegemonic approach, the Gramscian approach, are advocating. So I think that it is interesting to see that according to the kind of conception of radical politics that you have, you are going to have very conflicting way of reading the recent protests and evaluating their potential. As a starting point, I think that it is necessary to distinguish within popular mobilization that have recently taken place in liberal democratic societies between those that follow more, I would call it more traditional, even if they are a bit different, but more traditional left patterns, and those that diverge from them. Because despite undeniable contact among them, I think it is, for instance, misleading to put in the same category the Spanish indignados and the student movement in Chile. And this is often done. But I think that it's really very misleading. In the Chilean case, what we have is what I would say nearer to a classical left-wing mobilization of students fighting for better education with specific demands which are addressed to the state. This is a movement which is formally organized with elected leaders who do not reject party affiliation. For instance, the first one of those leaders, the well-known Camila Vallejo, is in fact a member of the Communist Party, and now she is planning to run as a candidate for the Communist Party in the national election. So you can see that it's very different the situation with the indignados of the M15 who call for democracia realia, rejecting the representative democratic system in favor of real democracy and promoting assemblyism instead of parliamentarism. Insisting on remaining without leaders, they refuse to have anything to do with traditional political institutions like election, parties, and trade unions. A similar negative posture towards representative instances is found in the Greek version of the indignados, the aganakismenoi, that will say it? Aganakismeni, okay. And among the various occupied movements in Europe and North America. Although I must say that in the case of the latter, there is at least in the Occupy a movement, an indication of who is the enemy. Is Occupy Wall Street, Occupy London Stock Exchange, so clearly the financial institutions are presented as the enemy and presented as the one person oppressing the remaining 99. I will have something to say about this in a moment. But I think that it's a step further from the indignados, because indignados are democracia realia and without really determination of who is the adversary or the enemy. What indignados and occupiers do share is their rhizomatic horizontal character. They function as leaderless networks, as platform without a center. At the beginning, before they were evicted by the local authorities, their focus was on establishing camps in public square. Having moved to the second phase, they are now trying to diversify their form of protest through activism at the neighborhood level with specific issues concerning debt, foreclosure and eviction among others. I mean, of course, not all of those movements still exist, but those who still exist have moved. They change their strategy. They can't occupy public space anymore, so they are really trying to do activism at the neighborhood level. In the case of Spain, but more importantly, in fact, in Greece, we've also seen something different, is that the nature of the protest, which began, by small groups, have widened because new constituencies have been involved in the protest. For instance, in Spain, where the right-wing Partido Popular is now in power with an absolute majority, the protests have widened and they've taken a different character. Now we've seen a massive mobilization led by the trade unions, and different sectors of the population have been active in those. Unfortunately, what we do not see in the case of Spain, and that's a big difference with Greece, is some kind of real political leadership. There is no party which has been able to intervene and give them some kind of specific orientation to those movements. So they remain to a certain extent without an effective political articulation. In Greece it's very different, and because there we find mass protests organized by the radical left party Syriza against the policies of the ruling conservative New Democracy Party and of course the European Union. So I will come back to the case of Greece in a moment, but at this point what I want to indicate is that we should take account the role of parties, the left parties, when we envisage the future of those movements and their potential for change, because when they are being really interesting positive development is where there's been an intervention of an articulation of those movements with a more traditional political institution. And I think when we take into account those later developments in Spain and in Greece, the complex nature of the protest is brought to the fore, and this is why their critique of the current democratic system can be interpreted in different ways. We find certainly among them activists who are against any form of representation altogether. They express a total rejection of liberal democracy and yearn for society reconciled with itself through direct democracy. The aim of other groups, however, is not to get rid of representative institutions, but to improve them so as to make them more accountable to the citizen. Privileging the first type of critique, many theorists, influenced by the Exodus approach, have seen in recent mobilization a manifestation of the power of the multitude, constructing new forms of social relation outside traditional institutions. As I've already indicated, they celebrate the realization of the common, and in fact they present the encampments as a prefiguration of what they call absolute democracy. Some theorists, influenced by this approach, prioritizing the exodus from existing form of democracy, have put the emphasis on the emergence of new democratic practice of an horizontalist and presentist nature. That's the way they call it, horizontalist and presentist. Isabelle Laurie, for instance, who see those movements as characteristic of the new form of struggle of the precarious worker which are typical of post-Fordism. Laurie argued that what Spanish indignados, with their call for democracia realia advocate, is, she said, not so much a direct democracy in which all the citizens will be able to participate, because this is still too much representative direct democracy. What they want is a radically different understanding of democracy, a democracy beyond representation, a democracy in actu, and that's what she called presentist democracy. I think it's worth quoting her analysis at length because it will give you an idea of the kind of argument which those people make. I quote Laurie. The Occupy movement signify an exodus from the two complementary figures of direct and representative democracy. An exodus from vertical unifying institutionalization because they act in a non-juridical way and practice democracy in a presentist and horizontal way. This is no less than a break with the existing order of Western democracy. The exodus manifests itself in the central public square, in the assembly of the many, and in practicing new form of living. The presentist movement is self-organizing and instituting a democratic constituent power, which does not want to repeat the old struggle over the takeover of power, but instead seek to release itself from the juridical logic of representation and sovereignty. End of quote. Laurie claims that the diverse occupation movement represents radical changes in politics, in society and economics, and that they signal the emergence of a constituent power beyond representation. Following the analysis of Antonio Negri, she sees this constituent power as a process that cannot be represented nor embodied in a judicial institutionalized power. She insists that it must reject mediation through representation and should not be tamed into a people. Presentist democracy is, according to her, the opposite of representative democracy. It's a matter of collective political practices without any claims to government. So, that is really the kind of interpretation of those movements coming from the view of radical politics in terms of exodus. Well, of course, the mobilization of the Occupy type has received a lot of attention, and their resonance has been undeniable. But that should not make us forget that it's not the first time that citizens have assembled outside the traditional political channel to make their voice heard. A recent study undertaken at LSE, the London School of Economics, under the direction of Mary Kaldor and Sabine Schelschow, remind us that this kind of things have been around for some time, and they call that subterranean politics. And in fact, what they say that what we witnessed in 2011 and 2012 is the bubbling up of subterranean politics. This research at LSE is concentrated on the emancipatory form of subterranean politics, because among the subterranean politics, of course, we've got many different forms which are not at all emancipatory, but the struggle is they concentrate on the emancipatory form, and in fact they give pride of place to the indignant in Europe. They made a lot of interviews with the indignants and Occupy in Europe, and those interviews are quite interesting and revealing, because they in fact cast doubt about the claim that the anti-representative position is typical of the majority of the activists. Well, there is of course no denying that such views are found among the activists involved in those movements. But to present the aim of all the outrage as being the establishment of a democracy beyond representation is really to read those protests in a very unilateral way. But more importantly, in my view, even if those views were the dominant view in those movements, this would not be enough to conclude that such a strategy is adequate, and that practice informed by horizontality and presentism should provide the backbone of the progressive struggle. The question we should ask concerns the efficacy of such practices and their potential for bringing about a different type of society. In fact, I think it could be argued that the very evolution of Occupy reveals the limit of those practices, limits which have been acknowledged by the activists themselves. For instance, on 17 September 2012, just 1 year after the birth of Occupy Wall Street, Mark Greif, which had been an activist very involved in this movement, wrote an article where he asserted that although it had been successful in putting the issue of equality on the agenda, Occupy had failed in most of its objectives with respect to Wall Street and its struggle against the financial institution. Greif's appreciation of the pro and cons of Occupy camps is shared by many people who have celebrated their impact on the political discourse in the US, so the positive aspect, while noting their lack of strategy for bringing about institutional changes. Sure, in voicing the outrage against the obscene inequalities existing in the midst of Western societies, these movements have contributed to raise important issues. And this can hopefully motivate people to call for an alternative. But this is only the beginning. And to effectively transform power relations, the new consciousness that could arise out of those protests requires institutional channels. That's my argument. To challenge neoliberalism, it is necessary to engage with its key institution, and it's not enough to organize new form of existence of the common outside the dominant capitalist structure, as if the latter will progressively ebb away without any confrontation. But I must say that besides problem with the anti-institutionalist strategy of Occupy, I also have some reservation concerning the type of discourse in which that protest is articulated. It is certainly commendable to give voice to the outrage against the financial system, but I think that this must be done in a political way, targeting the ideological, economic and political forces that structure the system. Otherwise, there is a real danger. And here I want to insist, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case, but the real danger that current protests will operate in the register of morality, that is, on the basis of a good-bad dichotomy. It is certainly positive that Occupy, and here I insist again, in contrast to the Indignados, is a clearly defined adversary. No? London, Stock Exchange, Wall Street, in general, the financial institution. Yet, I find their slogan, "We are the 99%," rather unsatisfactory. I think it reveals a lack of awareness about the wide range of antagonism existing in society, and reveals a rather naive belief in the possibility of installing a consensual society once the bad 1% will have been eliminated. And I think that this kind of reasoning can too easily lead to some kind of moral condemnation of the rich, instead of a political analysis of the complex configuration of power forces that need to be challenged in order to create a more democratic society. And in addition to being too inclusive, I think that this slogan also seems to take for granted the pre-given unity of the we. And it obviates the necessary process of construction of this we through the articulation of a chain of equivalence among the manifold protests. And this is, I contend, the crucial political step without which no adequate strategy can be designed. But if the unity is already pre-given, so the crucial political task, this is not addressed. There is an interesting critique which has been addressed to those movements by Jason Hickel, who has argued that the absence of real political strategy among the movement calling for a consensual real democracy indicates, in his view, that they are still envisaging politics under a liberal framework, impeding them to apprehend the nature of the political. He claims that the shortcomings of Occupy and its incapacity to have real impact in undermining neoliberal patterns of capitalist accumulation come from the fact that the assumption and subjectivities that organize liberalism continue to operate in the Occupy movement. Analyzing, for instance, the hallmark of those movements, Hickel brings to light the way they are informed by liberal ideology. He said that, for instance, that Occupy structure of non-hierarchical, consensus-based participatory democracy is taking the liberal ethic of celebrating diversity and tolerance to its extreme, and that this impedes them to apprehend the nature of power in a capitalist society and the fact of hegemony. Moreover, he sees an anti-political attitude and what he calls the liberal ethic in full force in their refusal to organize around specific demands, so as not alienate those who might disagree and thereby discourage diversity. But I think it is possible to find another point of convergence between those movements and the liberal approach, and it is in their demonizing of the state, which is of course also a central feature of the neoliberal zeitgeist. I am in fact concerned to find this negative attitude with respect to the state in several left radical sectors. Such a convergence could be explained, and I think it is in my view the explanation, by a shared belief between those two views in the availability of a self-regulating society beyond division and beyond hegemony. Of course, such a society is envisaged very differently by the neoliberals and by those radicals. While the former, the neoliberal, deny the reality of existing power relations, the latter announce the coming of a society where power will have disappeared, with the self-organization of the multitude. Nonetheless, what we find in both versions is a common refusal of the political in its antagonistic dimension and the constitutive role of power. How could one, without eluding the fact that social relations are always power relations, pretend, for instance, with John Holloway, that it is possible to make the revolution without taking power? So, this is my critique or my presentation of the way in which those movements are interpreted by the Exodus people. And now what I would want to do is to present my alternative interpretation. Interpretation, what I call agonistic, and of course, you can imagine it follows a different line. On the political, my last book, today, where I criticize the current, what I call post-political trend, my diagnostic was that we are witnessing a crisis of representation, which is a consequence of the consensus at the center that has come to dominate politics in liberal democratic societies. This consensus, which is the result of the unchallenged hegemony of neoliberalism, and consensus, the center-right and center-left, basically they offer the same kind of politics. There is no alternative at all to neoliberal globalization. But believe that there is no alternative. So this is something which I argue deprives democratic citizens of an agonistic debate where they can make their voice heard and choose between real alternatives. Till recently, it was mainly through right-wing populist parties that people were able to vent their anger against such a post-political situation. But with the recent protests, I think we are seeing the emergence of other ways, certainly much more estimable, of reacting against this democratic deficit that characterize our post-democratic societies. If so many people, not only among the youth, but across the whole population, are now taking to the street, I think that's because they've lost faith in traditional parties, and they feel that their voice cannot be heard through traditional political channel. It's one of the motto of the protester claims. We have a vote, but we don't have a voice. And it's true. Because in a post-political system they can vote, but it's not a voice, because it's basically for two parties which offer the same program. And there's this refusal of the post-political order. This is my argument. Those protests are a refusal of the post-political order. Current protests can be read then as a call for a radicalization of liberal democratic institutions, not for their rejection. What they exact as better, more inclusive form of representation. To satisfy their demand for voice, existing representative institutions have to be transformed, profoundly transformed, and of course new ones need to be established, so as to create the condition for a real agonistic confrontation where the citizen will be offered real alternative. And of course, the main requisite for such a confrontation to take place is that we need the emergence of a genuine left, a left that will not be center left, a left that is going to offer an alternative to social liberal consensus that dominant in center left parties. And I think that the case of Greece can serve as an illustration of such an approach. For me, when I look at the panorama in Europe, is really where in Greece, where I think that there is something showing the direction for this kind of popular movement that I see as the real answer to this crisis. There, of course, as we know, popular mobilization are currently led by Syriza, a coalition of several left parties, whose objective is to come to power through elections in order to implement a set of radical reforms. Their aim is clearly not the demise of liberal democratic institutions, but their transformation, so as to make them a vehicle for the expression of popular demand. But the French situation can also provide interesting indication of a move in the similar direction. Of course, not as developed, but it is interesting. Because, for instance, the capacity of Jean-Luc Mélenchon, the candidate of the Front de Gauche, a coalition of several left parties, so something similar to Syriza, to mobilize the youth in the 2012 presidential election in France was really remarkable. Many young people who in other countries would have been found in occupied camps or simply remained skeptical against political involvement felt that there was a space for their demands in the program of the Front de Gauche, and they participated with great enthusiasm in Mélenchon's campaign for what he called a citizen revolution. So I think that Mélenchon and Alexis Tsipras, the leader of Syriza, are really indicating, in my view, the kind of political direction which I feel necessary. Of course, they are often accused of being populist. But I think that far from being a ground for a critique, this should be seen as something positive. Because the aim of a left popular movement should be to mobilize passion toward the creation of a people, so as to bring about a progressive collective will, to use Gramsci's expression. Of course, the people can be constructed in very different ways, and some of them are incompatible with the left-wing project. It all depends on how the adversary is defined. And this is where the difference between left-wing populism and right-wing populism is determined. Whereas for right-wing populism, and here the case of Marine Le Pen in France will be really paradigmatic, the adversary is identified with the immigrant, and more especially the Muslim. The adversary for a left-wing populist movement should be constituted by the configuration of forces which sustain neoliberal hegemony. So you've got very different people which are constructed through those two discursive strategies. There is a citizen awakening in Europe and in the USA. I think it's very encouraging because it is a reaction against the post-political consensus. Clearly, for me, so this is how I want to interpret those movements. A taboo has been broken, and many voices are now being heard, contesting the inequalities existing in our societies. But to effectively challenge neoliberal hegemony, it is crucial that all the energy that is erupted are not diverted towards wrong alley. And I'm afraid that this is what could happen if representative institutions become the target of the protest. There is no denying that representative institutions are in crisis in their current neoliberal liberal democratic form. But I do not believe that the solution resides in the establishment of a non-representative democracy, whatever it is, or that extra-parliamentary struggle are the only vehicle for making democratic advances. Such a view are popular because their chance, of course, with the idea fashionable among sectors of the left that the multitude could auto-organize itself, avoiding taking power and becoming state. To find such an anti-political approach among activists involved in the various movements of the outrage I feel worrying, because it forecloses designing an adequate strategy for their struggle. When representation is seen as the problem, the aim cannot be to engage with current institutions so as to make them more representative and more accountable, but to discard them entirely. The objective of the movement will be visualized in terms of an exodus from the given form of democracy on the ground that attempting to transform existing institutions is vain and that representative democracy is to be relinquished. Many among those who reject representation identify representative democracy with its current post-democratic form and with the actual working of the parliamentary system. They do not see that the problem concerns the way representative institutions function at the moment and the fact that so many voices are excluded from representation. What needs to be challenged is the lack of alternative offered to the citizen, not the very idea of representation. A pluralist democratic society cannot exist without representation. To begin with, and of course here I could, but it's not the space, make a more theoretical critique of the very idea, the possibility of a non-representative democracy. But just let me indicate a few points. To begin with, as the anti-essentialist approach is made clear, identities are never already given. They are always produced through identification. It is, and this process of identification is a process of representation. It is through representation that collective political subjects are created. They do not exist beforehand. Every assertion of a political identity is thereby interior, not exterior to the process of representation. Secondly, in a democratic society where pluralism is not envisaged as in the harmonious anti-political form, and where the ever-present possibility of antagonism is taken into account, representative institutions, by giving form to the division of society, play a crucial role in allowing for the institutionalization of this conflictual dimension. So I think that, in fact, democracy is unthinkable without representation. However, such a role of institutionalizing conflictual dimension can only be fulfilled through the availability of an agonistic confrontation. What constitutes the central problem in our current post-political society is the absence of such an agonistic confrontation. And of course this is not going to be remedied through horizontalist practices. But this is not to say, and that's certainly not the kind of argument I want to make, that those type of activism to which this term refer, do not have a role to play in an agonistic model of democracy. I'm convinced that the variety of what is sometimes called extra-parliamentary struggle and the multiple forms of activism are valuable, not only to raise consciousness and to bring to the fore issues that are neglected, but also as providing a realm for the cultivation of different social relations. What I contend is that those practices, besides the fact that they always entail an element of representation, cannot provide a substitute for representative institutions, and that it is necessary to establish a synergy between those practices and other more institutional forms of struggle. If the protest movement refuses to establish alliances with traditional channels deemed as intrinsically impervious to democratic transformation, then their radical potential will be lost. Amazingly, some activists today in those movements are still celebrating the horizontalist practices that they see in Argentina in 2001, the movement of the piqueteros, presenting them as the model to follow, without acknowledging the limit of such a strategy. They do not seem to realize that the democratic advances that have taken place in Argentina, as well as in other South American countries in the last 10 years, have been made possible thanks to an articulation between those extra-parliamentary and parliamentary struggles, and that the state has played a very important role in those countries in the democratic process, democratic advance, and in challenging neoliberalism. Those, I think, are the experiences from which the European left can learn, and it is high time to stop romanticizing spontaneism and horizontalism. The call for democracy that is now being voiced in a variety of quarters can only produce lasting effects if the activists involved in those movements, instead of implementing a strategy of withdrawal, accept becoming part of a progressive collective will, engaged in a war of position, then in a term referring to Gramsci, to radicalize democratic institutions and establish a new hegemony. Thank you.